Witch by Rebecca Lloyd. I find it very queer indeed how, out of absolutely nothing, certain individuals are suddenly venerated in our society. One day they are nobodies, and the next the whole of Christendom is talking about them, and whatever it is they are purported to have done. Fame can certainly change one. For instance, it's hard for me now to go to the milk machine on the corner or buy a newspaper and a bar of chocolate in our local shop without someone smiling at me obsequiously, and I am just about to have my third interview this week with another little women's magazine. I'm watching the girl reporter now as she comes up the garden path towards my front door. A very pleasing young lady she is too, kitted out in a pleasant manner, with a delightful face and jolly pretty lips from what I can see. The same could not be said for Beatrice, and I can't bring to mind a single thing that does not cause me irritation with regard to my wife, even these days when I'm feeling pretty shabby about everything. I should forget about her, but there you are, you see. That is very hard to do. My last sight of her comes back to me frequently, and in the most unlikely of situations. I hesitate even to describe her, although there is not an angle or a facet of her that I do not know intimately. Even in the early days of our courtship, I knew what I'd be getting, and although I recognized that her skull was Nordic, I had not assumed it would elongate quite in the way it did over time. I called her my Viking Queen then, and she liked it when I did so. But finding compliments for her wasn't the easiest task in the world. Very clean teeth, I'll give her that, but they were rather on the large and horsey side, and it really wasn't long before I became fixated by them in a manner of speaking, in that I both wanted to see them again, and at the same time dreaded the thought of it. Had she ever learnt to open her mouth with moderation, her startling row of teeth would not have been so obvious. However, she would brace herself for a yawn with a curious little yelping sound, and I, intent on other things, would nevertheless find myself succumbing to a state of gruesome curiosity, and be unable to stop my eyes quickly seeking the palace and its guardsmen. And then, with my willpower to resist weakened, I would brace myself to watch the operation of that very big jaw, rather in the way one might stop to gawp at a crane on a building site. I, to some extent, blame my father, as he encouraged the relationship. "Large women are often very homely creatures," he explained. "At least I think I recall reading that fact in the newspaper once. But come what may, what you don't want is a giddy little flibbertigibbet, do you? That would be most tiresome." We were walking through the apple orchard back towards the house, waiting for the lunch gong. I had not taken Beatrice with me on that occasion. "She listens awfully well," I'd remarked, because in those days that was one of the characteristics I admired about Beatrice. I really find it intolerable when a woman starts to show off in company and discuss things willy-nilly. "It's the most important decision you will make in your life, Robin," my father said, "and you'd better not get it wrong. The vital thing is that she must be obliging and without a single cantankerous cell in her body, and in your case, as you intend to be a writer, she must at all costs be patient and have faith in you, apart from making sure you're comfortable and well-fed. Of course, you have certain duties towards her as well. However, this is probably not the time and place to go into those," he mused. I think I pretty well decided that I was going to marry Beatrice at that very moment. And neither father nor I thought about discussing it in any great detail with mother, as she, of course, was that obliging woman without a single cantankerous cell in her body, and she'd have simply said, "Oh, Robin, how marvellous. Do bring her over as soon as you can." That, in fact, was what she did say when I stated my intention towards Beatrice, briefly to her, during luncheon that day. Beatrice and I moved here to Welland Garden City directly after we were married. We followed Father's instructions and endeavoured to get to know our neighbours as quickly as we could, so as not to create any hostility through our tardiness, and as a consequence find ourselves judged to be snobbish or bohemian, or indeed communist. "Oh, surely people wouldn't," Beatrice began, looking with slightly bulging eyes across the table at my father as he delivered his advice. It was a Sunday close to Easter, and we'd gone down to my parents' place, Chetwynd House, for a visit. "Small-town rules," Father explained. "You don't want to find yourself isolated or on the fringes of society, do you? English people are naturally very particular about with whom they come into close proximity, and so it's your duty to put your neighbours at their ease."
"Shouldn't it be the neighbours welcoming the newcomers, like they do in America with apple pies?"
my mother trilled up, out of nowhere. "Oh, do be quiet, Virginia," Father retorted promptly. Beatrice's hand had fluttered up to the collar of her dress, I noticed, and her cheeks had coloured up quite markedly. "But we are English," she said quietly. "Surely we shouldn't have to—" "Yes, I'm afraid you do have to bend over backwards to make decent English people accept you these days. And it's hardly surprising, is it? What with the memory of the war still fresh, and the immigration situation completely out of control."
"Oh," Beatrice whispered. "Only this morning in the newspaper," my mother began.
Yes, we have all read the papers today, and in my opinion it is indicative of the times that so many white people were arrested in that riot at Notting Hill. We don't need to discuss it further at this table. This conversation has come to an end." After that, one could hear nothing but the clock in the hall ticking in its ponderous way, and the scraping of spoons on plates. Mother had made green jelly with gooseberries embedded for dessert. And so it was that I set Beatrice to organising a series of dinner parties after we'd settled into the Welland Garden City house, and we did our jolly best to fit in all around. The first year was awfully nerve-wracking for both of us, and I began to have dreams about sinkholes appearing in the street, which Beatrice interpreted rather cleverly, I thought, as symbolic of my anxiety about being accepted. I'd found a job that suited me perfectly as manager in a busy bookshop, and the last thing I wanted to do was to discover that we'd been found wanting by our neighbours, and had to either live in isolation in number 25 Sweetbriar Street, or to move to a less rigid neighbourhood. "Is there anywhere less rigid in England than here?" Beatrice inquired. "Or are all small English towns more or less the same?" She had, even at this early stage, developed an annoying habit of speaking to me whilst still appearing to be reading whatever book she was attached to at the time. I stared at the parting in her brown-coloured hair, and a little surge of tension arose in my throat. "Oh, don't be so silly, Beatrice." She looked up and blinked at me in a way that on another woman might have been charming. "Silly? What's silly about that?" "That's enough now. This conversation has ended," I informed her. I turned away at that point to retrieve my cardigan from the chair by the window, and when I heard her slam her book shut, it really quite startled me, and so I turned about again to look fully at her in the gloom of the drawing-room. What light there was fell behind her seated form, a pallid greyish type of light that certain English winter days always seem to manufacture. "Perhaps it's you who is a little rigid," she whispered. "Perhaps it's you who is doing the judging." She'd taken on a slightly huddled look, and as I tried to see her face more clearly, something rose up behind her, some curious and slightly flickering visual disturbance. It cannot have been there for more than 3 seconds, and in the time it took for me to close my eyes and massage my lids with my fingertips, it had gone again. I was evidently overtired. "Is that one of the books I brought home?" I asked her.
"It's poetry," she announced, placing it against her chest and rising from her seat. "T.S. Eliot. Not one of yours."
"Ah, friend of Ezra Pound and all that," I told her. "If you want to know about him, you'll have to talk to me on another occasion. I'm really rather fagged out today, Beatrice." She didn't persist in her inquiry, but instead seemed to rather glide out of the room. And a minute or so later, I heard the bedroom door open and close quietly. For a few seconds I stood rather bewildered, alone in the living room. It was as if I'd suddenly lost count of something, an unsettling feeling, and I shivered slightly and buttoned my cardigan right up to the top. Our dinner parties did pay off in some measure in that I met Martin Small, who rapidly became my very best chum. We had the same sense of humour, and there was on occasion such an understanding between us, almost an intuition you might call it, that we only had to glance at each other to trigger off gales of laughter, even if it was about something ever so trivial. Beatrice complained from time to time about the noise we made, and I felt a slight triumph, knowing that I was able to affect her in that way. As she had become so devoted to reading that some jolly fierce arguments had broken out between us. Not only did she read before lunch, and whoever has heard of that, but, and this is what I found particularly insulting, she would read whilst preparing my evening meal, as if it were a tiresome task, rather than an expression of her regard for me. One wretched scene sticks in my mind above all others. I'd come silently into the kitchen in my slippers, and she hadn't heard me, as her back was to the door. She was barefooted, a condition I thoroughly despise, other than during beach trips, and she was wearing the striped slacks I loathed, but about which I had refrained from voicing my opinion, on the advice of my mother.
"It takes a while for a new bride to understand by instinct what her husband needs, Robin, and how to dress properly. Do try to be patient with her. She's a lovely person. How's the scribbling?"
"Scribbling, mother? Scribbling?"
"Oh, don't be so glum and cross-patchy. The writing, I mean. How's the novel coming along?"
I flushed furiously, and hated myself for not being able to control it while Mother was gazing at me. "I'm working on some ideas, but quite honestly, the bookshop takes a deal of my energy at the moment. And so, what with our social obligations in the neighbourhood, bowls and bridge and badminton and so forth, I've hardly a moment to myself. One needs quietness in which to write, Mother. Otherwise, I fear, the muse will not come."
"Isn't Beatrice your muse?"
"Beatrice, you say? Good heavens, no. Whatever made you think that?" As I stood in our kitchen doorway in Sweetbriar Street, thinking about Mother's lamentably poor understanding of my life, I watched Beatrice's plaits move from side to side across her back, as she alternately attended to something on the stove, and glanced to her left at one of the pages of the blue-covered book she'd been carrying around all week, that she had held down at the edge with a wooden spoon. My wife in the kitchen, in her floral apron, cooking my dinner, was a terrifically pleasing image, but in this instance the vision was horribly marred by the fact that the book should have been a recipe book, yet it was not. "New book?" I inquired loudly. "No, Robin." She turned towards me, and her narrow face was really quite devoid of expression, meaning she had known I was standing in the doorway all along, and had had time to compose herself, or she really was too insensitive to understand how very hurt her constant, otherness made me. "I thought you were down at the cherry tree with Martin. It was so quiet in the house. I didn't hear you come in," she said. "What are you reading?" E. Cummings. It's exciting." "Cummings, eh? Well, he's a bit of a novelty right now, I dare say, But the areas you need to be concentrating on are the Victorians. You need to work your way through the poets from beginning to end, you see, to make any sense of the progression of thought and sensibility. Beatrice squinted at me and frowned. Do you think so, Robin? Of course. That's what a real reader would do. A real reader. Please, don't repeat me. Are you saying I'm not a reader? In a manner of speaking, yes, I am. I mean, you may have your head stuck in a book every hour that God sends, but I'd hazard a guess and say you don't actually read. What do you mean I don't read? You don't read, I repeated, and I began to hear the high-pitched whistling that occurs inside my left ear when I become particularly agitated. A bit like a kettle on the boil, you see. How do you know I don't read? You don't live inside my head, Robin, surely. Because you don't talk like a reader. Readers know all kinds of things, talk in all kinds of wonderful ways, have a vast store of knowledge. I have readers come into the bookshop frequently, and they really are very interesting men indeed. Robin, are you upset about something? Take that book of Chekhov stories I gave you last Christmas. I never see you carrying that about with you. You see, you don't read. I'm reading poetry right now. The wrong poets, as I explained. The kind of poets that awful, scruffy, duffel-coated brigade who went on that march last year would read. Bertrand Russell's lot. I could feel myself getting very worked up by this time. I was breathing quite hard, and I did feel a little dizzy, which would have accounted for what followed shortly. Well, I suppose this would be the right time to tell you that I've been writing poetry myself for some time, Robin, and I've had a letter from a publisher who's interested in... Oh, don't be so silly, Beatrice. And is there any chance at all that you could put some shoes on? You make me feel damn cold standing there like that. I could see the beginnings of something quivering in the air around Beatrice's head. Steam from the saucepan, I assumed. Look, whatever it is I've done to upset you, Robin, I'm sorry, she said, and she reached behind her, found the book, and put it in her apron pocket out of sight. But you see, I was angrier still at her confession. She had no business trespassing into the literary world any more than I had in trying to bake cakes. Please attend to the cooking, will you, Beatrice? I have started to read Chekhov, though, she continued, turning back to the stove, and the stories I've read so far, bar one, have been like stories told in a pub. Little anecdotal stories with lots of exclamation marks everywhere. You know, like the kind of story Martin Small might come out with, and then laugh very loudly about, and for a long time. Please don't talk about my chum like that, Bea. What has got into you? She didn't answer, and in my opinion it was correct of her not to. So now you're telling me you don't like Chekhov? Well, not so far, apart from one story called Champagne, which began to have some depth to it. Just, I was starting to feel a tad queer. It was very steamy in the kitchen, and I was finding it hard to breathe properly, and there was a very odd haze around Beatrice that forced me to squint in order to see her properly. But to speak of Chekhov in that manner was not something I was going to allow. Well, it's evident that you simply don't get Chekhov yet, to speak in your kind of slang, Beatrice, I said. Or dig it. You don't dig Chekhov yet. My wife turned around again and stared at me for a long second, and then she moved the pan from the gas and turned off the stove. Dinner's nearly ready, Robin. Do you want to wash up? I don't believe I answered her, because my attention was drawn to some really quite odd effects set off by the cooking steam, which was creating a quivering and increasingly elaborate optical illusion around Beatrice. In fact, the steam must have permeated her clothing, and it was now bulking out to one side of her standing form as a deuced peculiar mirror image of her. It's put me in mind instantly of an article I read in the National Geographic once, about the Brocken spectre. They say, don't they, that if you go to certain mountainous regions of the world, you could encounter one such optical illusion. But be that as it may, I wasn't going to let the Chekhov topic drop that easily. I drew a breath. There are some highly respected writers who lionized Chekhov, and here are you, Beatrice Wallington, a housewife from Welland Garden City, who knows better. How can that possibly be? I didn't say I knew better, Robin, but I don't think there's anything to get in Chekhov. The stories are plainly there. There's nothing hidden. You can tell he was a playwright, though. He was a playwright. That's what I just said. In his short stories, he sometimes writes as if he's writing the directions for a play. You really are the most infuriating woman, Bee, I shouted. What on earth would you know about such things? It was at this point that the pattern of steam hovering around my wife's body became repulsively slick. That is the only way I am able to describe it. I could now clearly see a second image of the woman I had married, standing to the right of the stove, a short distance away from Beatrice. Same long face, same thin teddy bear-coloured hair parted in the middle and worn close to the scalp, same large wrists and gangling arms. What was far from the same, however, was the expression on the thing's face, and what it was doing with its fingers. I was witnessing a depth of vulgarity that I am sure you wouldn't even expect to encounter in the brothels of Soho. The lowest ones, I mean. Its mouth was turned down, the lips slightly puffed out in a teasing kind of way, and even as I watched, it took on texture and colour and the pretence of solidity, as if to more closely resemble my wife, and thus fool me further. I recall taking 1 or 2 steps forward towards the real Beatrice. She looked startled, and then worried as I advanced, and all the while the thing was holding its middle finger erect in front of its own face, and grinning very insolently at me behind it. Shattered nerves, our doctor declared, offering me a French cigarette from a rather handsome silver cigarette case, and easing himself into the Henlow armchair adjacent to my bed. Fairly newly married, aren't you? Wife treating you well? That's part of the muddle, Doctor. How ought I to expect my wife to treat me, do you suppose? Life. Life, I repeated. Life, it's been a while since I thought about matters philosophical. I said, is life treating you well, Mr. Wallington? I beg your pardon, I began, and on the instant could not think of a suitable reply, until Martin came to mind. Well, I see from your expression that nothing is too far amiss, the doctor declared. So my advice is to take things easy for a week. Take some time off work, go out with the wife somewhere. Cinema, perhaps. Hound of the Baskervilles with Peter Cushing is showing at the Pavilion this week. We smoked for a while in my room that morning, and didn't get ourselves into too much of a fug, as the weather was warm, the May blossom was out, and both bedroom windows were open. It occurred to me right then and there that were I to take Beatrice on holiday, I might be able to jog her out of her infernal reading habit with a change of scenery. Cornwall was our destination. Nothing could be more English, and it was a country Beatrice was not familiar with, which meant I'd be able to introduce her to places of delight and beauty, little fishing villages, small hotels, pleasant beaches and cliff walks. We set off towards the train station in jolly good humour in Reggie, our standard 10 car, and both of us were in fine fettle at the start of our little adventure.
I was very worried, I have to say, Bea informed me. So glad you're feeling more rested, Robin. When you walked towards me in the kitchen that day...
It is very considerate of you to worry, I answered. I was looking out for the turning to the train station and hoping we'd be able to leave the car in the lane adjacent while we were away.
No,
Beatrice whispered. This is the right turning. Look, there's a sign to the station over there. Do let me drive in peace.
No, it wasn't considerate, is what I mean.
Well, call it what you like, I said, taking the turning rather definitely. I was looking forward to smelling the sea air, and hoping the little cottage we'd rented was both clean and comfortable, and that there was milk in the refrigerator, as the owner had promised.
I was worried you were going to attack me, Robin.
Perfect parking spot right here, I told her. Pardon me, what did you say? Oh, and do let's remember to take the car rug with us on the train.
The way your face looked.
What's wrong with my face?
I don't mean now.
In that case, the conversation has ended, Bea. Let's just look forward. I do love a long train journey, don't you?
Since it is to be so long, Robin, would you mind awfully if I read my book? No, if you want to talk at any time, I shan't mind. Robin?
I was really very annoyed with her, yet at the same time I knew I had a whole 2 weeks to break her reading habit and bring her attention back to where it should have been. I planned also, given the opportunity, to try 1 or 2 things out on her that I had learnt before I ever met her. Learnt in Soho, in a place I know. Come along, Bea, let's look lively. Don't want to miss the train, I said, in answer.
Your face.
Oh, for heaven's sake, Bea, what are you mumbling about? We'd reached the ticket booth, and I was hunting for my wallet in my inner coat pocket.
In the kitchen that day, I mean.
When our tickets were safely in the inner pocket of my jacket, I took Bea by the elbow and walked her onto the platform rather smartly. The extraordinary incident in the kitchen was not something I wished to revisit, but it was only at that moment it occurred to me to wonder if Bea had been aware of the thing that stood beside her in the darkness down there.
What of it? I whispered. My face. You looked as if you wanted to harm me, she replied.
A curious shiver moved up my spine, and for a second the platform edge seemed to curl inwards towards us. I put the largest of our suitcases down slowly and gripped the car rug to my chest, cheerful red and green plaid rug with pleasing tassels. It wasn't exactly you that brought it on, I whispered, looking up the track to the distant Budleia Grove in the hope that the train might be visible.
I do not believe I have ever seen such a look on anyone in my entire life, she continued. I was very worried.
Exactly how did I look? I asked her, because for the life of me, my memory of the incident was quite faulty, and I wanted to know of what she had been aware.
Furious, frightened, slightly crazy, like a sort of wild man, Robin. Sorry, but you did ask.
You absolutely couldn't see, could you?
Pardon me?
Couldn't see what I was looking at, to your left and next to the stove, gesticulating, grinning, hideous. No, of course you couldn't. Forgive me. Dr. Horsfield did explain what overwork and stretched nerves can do to the mind and senses. Of course you couldn't see it, Bea, because it wasn't really there.
Are you talking about the wetness?
The train had arrived. I moved our luggage back by 2 feet as it really was coming in full charge and hooting its horn in a glorious way. Look lively, Bea. Here we are. The train's approaching. Move back a little, won't you?" We settled into our compartment, and when no one else decided to enter, I was rather pleased as we were able to stretch out, at least until we'd reached the next station. I tried not to think about work and all the cataloguing that was needed in the smaller part of the shop in the history section. I thought instead about Martin and the last drink we'd had together in the cherry tree, and how I was going to implement the advice he'd given me regarding Beatrice. I stole a glance at her. She wasn't reading. Instead, she was staring in a concentrated manner out of the window, until I grew suspicious that she was doing it deliberately to annoy me. "Penny for them?" I said evenly. "Oh, the end of a poem," she replied. "What, trying to remember it? Did you bring the book it was in? One of the romantics I recommended?" She shook her head and turned to look at me, big jaw working silently, as if mechanical. I swallowed, a bit noisily, in warning to her. This was not the time to begin one of her earnest conversations. Not the time at all. "No," she said. "No, you haven't brought the book I recommended, or no, you can't remember the poem." "It's one of my own poems, Robin, an unfinished one. I was thinking about it." She was seated opposite me, and the sunlight blinked on and off her face as the train moved past some high metal railings. Most peculiar, like a neon sign gone wrong. I leant forward. "Ah, I see. The romantic's not good enough for Beatrice Wallington? It's just that it's part of a trilogy, and it's been nagging me for some while now." "And so what books did you bring with you, Beatrice? Not the Chekhov, I suppose?" She shook her head and stared down at her gloved hands as we entered the tunnel. It was as if the sudden and close darkness outside threw us into a different, more urgent state. "You just haven't understood Chekhov yet, as I have said before. That much is obvious." "What, all those exclamation marks and so on, you mean?" "That is probably just a reflection of the time he was writing in." "About 1885, about the same time as Henry James and the New Zealand short story writer whose name escapes me for the moment," my wife whispered. "You know, who wrote wonderfully subtle fiction, without great exclamation marks all over the place." "What New Zealand writer? There aren't any New Zealand writers. What a ridiculous idea." "The one Virginia Woolf said smelt like a civet cat. Surely you know, being a bookseller." "I don't read short stories, Beatrice." "Well, I do, Robin, and Chekhov has a lot of competition. Catherine Mansfield, that was her. Beautiful, subtle writer." "A woman, then." As I said that, we emerged from the tunnel into blinding sunlight, and in the blink of an eyelid, I saw, and then did not see, something on my wife's left-hand side. Hard to spot in the intensity of the light, but it was seated, that much I could detect. Seated and engaged in an insulting comical performance, trying to stick its fingers down its throat, as if gagging. Grinning the while. Just there, next to Beatrice. Her double. Then it was gone. "I think you should read some more Chekhov. Then maybe you'd understand it," I managed. I wished now to continue our journey in silence, but Beatrice had her intellectual face on and was leaning towards me. "Okay, tell me about the Chekhov stories that you know," she said. "I've only read about 10 of them," I whispered. "That's all right. Tell me all about them and why they're so good. Because I think the idea that Chekhov is the greatest short story writer ever is utter nonsense. I read them years and years ago. I can't remember anything about them except their lucidity. I was a schoolboy, for God's sake, Beatrice. I don't remember them in detail. Surely all good short stories should be lucid, Robin, don't you think? Whoever writes them. Look, Beatrice, we're coming into the station. Could you please move your coat onto the seat beside you to discourage people from entering our compartment?" Beatrice had been to a ladies' college, and she was really quite well-rounded in terms of education, but I'd have preferred to see more of the lady and less of the education in her, if I am to be honest. Martin's thoughts on the matter were often in my mind. "You really ought to seduce her more," he whispered one evening when we'd nipped off to the pub. Seduce? Don't look so shocked, Robin. You should lay in wait for her sometimes at the weekend, and try taking her upstairs in the middle of the afternoon. Or, I don't know what you think about the bathroom or kitchen floor, but... Martin, Beatrice is my wife, not a tart from Soho. He stared at me in a very knowing way and said, "Maybe it's time to blur the lines." So here we were, Beatrice and I in our little cottage by the sea, and it was early evening. "Perhaps we could have dinner in the village inn, just this once," I said. "I don't mean to mess up your meal plans for us, so if it's too difficult to reorganize things, do tell me." "What meal plans, Robin?" "For these 2 weeks," I replied. "I'd planned to do some writing and some walking. I hadn't thought about anything else." That thwarted me a bit, but I seized the moment in a way that would have made Martin proud of me. "No plans, eh?" I moved around the side of the table towards her. It was dark in the kitchen, as the ceiling was low and the window small. "Well, how about we discuss it upstairs?" I suggested. She really was very obdurate, my wife. "What difference would that make?" she asked. "You'd have thought she could have guessed what was on my mind, wouldn't you?" I stretched my hand out towards her waist, and she recoiled, as if it was a white and wavering snake thing, and then, again, at that precise moment, her double rose up behind her and held 2 fingers up towards me, while its face distorted into a truly horrible mess of lines and glinting teeth. My God! I stepped back rapidly, and as I did, I realized that this time it had materialized in an entirely more knowing manner. By which I mean to say that it appeared as a fully formed Beatrice, more or less straight away, with no steamy, blurry lines or anything of that sort at all. "Robin," my wife said, "what is wrong with you, dear? You look as if you've seen—" "Come and sit down. Perhaps the journey has fatigued you, and you're not absolutely well yet." As she moved towards me, with her hands outstretched, I backed away naturally, and I could not take my eyes off the filthy apparition that mimicked her kindly actions, made a parody of them just to the back of her. "Will you just turn around and look?" I whispered. "For the love of God, Bea, a thing is behind you, trying to be you." She reached me, and with her hands pushed me gently down into a cane chair. And the thing came with her, its face, Bea's face, that is, looking over her shoulder, was but a foot or so away from my own face, and was as substantial and realistic as my real wife's face, so that it seemed she had 2 heads, one pleated with concern, the other leering, suggestive, despicable. Beatrice didn't know about the shadow thing. I was quickly convinced of that. We had a good chat when we stopped for lunch on the cliffs the next day during our walk, and I questioned her closely. "It's a bit embarrassing, Robin," she began, "because each time you have one of your episodes, your little fits, I get a strange feeling. And it's not like being out in the woods with no coat when it's raining, or anything remotely of that kind. She stopped for a second. Anything remotely as glorious of that kind, I mean, she said, almost in a whisper. But I get a sort of raw, wet feeling at the back of me. Sounds rather rude, doesn't it? Yet there isn't another way I can explain it. Raw, wet feeling, you say? Yes, I've told you about it before. No, you certainly haven't, Mrs. Wallington. I'm sorry, Robin, but I was trying to explain it to you when we were at the train station, but you weren't listening. I beg your pardon. You were gazing up the line and waiting for our train. Look, dearest, this is an absolute aside, and please forgive me for it. But could you just think about not calling me Mrs. Wallington? It's not that I don't want to be it, you understand? But it's the way you say it, as if suddenly because I've taken on your name, it's my duty to change being who I actually am. And that was not... Good God, woman! Of course that's your duty. Whatever else did you think? Bee ducked her head and stared at the orange peel she held in her hand as if it was a mysterious substance. And then she began to cry, and I watched her tears fall, one behind the other, onto the yellow flowers of her frock stretched across her thighs. And for a while I was perfectly hypnotized and very in love with her. I think it was the simplicity of the moment. We were close to the edge of the cliffs. We could hear the sea. The clouds were splendidly long and white and really rather dramatic. And as her tears fell, the sun shone through each one of them and made it a diamond. And then up rose that thing behind her. It pointed at the cliff edge and flapped one hand down sharply, and I knew exactly what it was telling me. The house in Sweetbriar Street was awfully empty when I returned without Beatrice, and there was something about the fire grate that got on my nerves rather, particularly when the wind came down the chimney over the remains of the summer and brought that smell of burnt coal forward into the room. I have spent an awful lot of time in Martin's company lately, and I feel I might have gone under were it not for him. His opinion of Bee's poetry more or less coincides with my own. That is to say, she really should have told me she was sending it out to publishers. It's all very well to have a hobby of that type, but to consider yourself good enough to be published takes the whole business onto a different level, don't you think? Of course, I allowed the publishing people who contacted me on my return from holiday to go ahead and do whatever they wanted with what they had of my wife's. But I never would have supposed for an instant that she'd become as famous as she now is in the writing world. It's really rather marvellous to have been married to her, because people treat me with considerable deference as her husband. But more thrilling than that, by a long chalk, is that I've actually begun to write myself at long last. I've purchased a particular pen, the nib of which is neither too heavy nor too scratchy, and a small exercise book that I can take with me in the pocket of my greatcoat. Of course, nobody must know about it until the time is right, although I'm finding it awfully tempting to let Martin in on it, as he's the chum I trust most, and the only one to whom I ever described the infuriating side of Beatrice, her blinking vacant eyes, her bloody absent-mindedness, and her disregard of simple chores. I think even now I'm furious with her, and particularly when I remember the first proper years of our marriage, when she only ever picked up a pen to make a shopping list or do the crossword. Martin never did marry himself, and so he speaks from a pure kind of wisdom. He told me several times on my return from holiday what a fetch was. I had never heard of such a thing before, But when I described the horror that rose up behind B, he had no hesitation in explaining it to me. A fetch is an apparition, just like the one I saw behind my wife. It comes as a signal of death. It comes when someone is about to die.
You see, old man, Martin said, it means you couldn't possibly have done anything to prevent her death, he told me. It was coming anyway.
I don't think you quite understand, Martin. I thought back to that day on the cliff. B was crying, and for the life of me I couldn't understand why. And anyway, it's always seemed to me that this whole business of women crying is a total trap. Surely it's done to make us feel guilty and wrong and so forth, isn't it? But curiously enough, you see, I really did love her at that moment. And then her creature rose up behind her again. I looked across to Martin. He'd spoken to me, apparently.
Pardon? I said, what is it you think I don't understand, old chap?
He passed over his open cigarette case, and I was happy to be smoking freely again. We were in my living room. We heard a fox bark. It was late. I think we both knew that he'd be staying over. The drive back to his house would be too long. It was my fault in a way. I'd taken him on a lengthy walk that day, but said very little, as it wasn't a situation in which you could talk seriously to another chap.
I'm not sure what it is you imagine I'm missing, Robin, he said.
She didn't fall, you know. Or haven't I made that clear? I suggested we walk to the cliff edge and watch the waves banging against the rock ledge beneath. Relentless, you know. Again, again, and again. Never any bloody ending to it. Always there. Always.
Steady on, Robin.
The same sad-sounding fox barked again into the night. The back door was open, and moths were coming in through the kitchen and making their way to the living room to circle the night. It wasn't accidental. I pushed her over the cliff, Martin. I got my hands on her back and shoved her over the edge. I saw her go momentarily, but not completely, because my legs gave out at the same time and I flopped onto the grass. It was I who did it, you see. So how can the creature have been a fetch?
Take it easy, Robin. Is there any reason why the one who causes the death shouldn't be able to see the fetch? I'd have thought it would have been rather the opposite.
The one who causes the death, I repeated. How elegantly you put that.
Well, look here, old man. You have my every sympathy, as you know, but it's time you pulled yourself together, because you now have a very important role in society as the widower of the poetess Beatrice Wallington, and the keeper of her estate.
He leant forward and gazed at me candidly.
And unless I'm very much mistaken, women will find you a rather attractive prospect as a consequence.
He winked rather slowly, in a way that few men are able to master, and instantly I felt that all was right with the world. As I explained a good while back now, I'm watching the girl reporter as she comes up the garden path towards my front door. A very pleasing young lady she is too, kitted out in a pleasant manner, with a delightful face, and jolly pretty lips from what I can see. Awfully nice legs as well, by the way. So if you'll excuse me, I must go to the door. Today's story was Fetch. by Rebecca Lloyd. It was read by Jasper Lestrange. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that, and until next time, sweet dreams.